Welcome to Church Without Walls. Today's kind of a special episode where I'm remembering my father who passed away during the week. So, James Alexander Kirkwood, the Duke. If you're used to Church Without Walls, this is going to be a more personal episode than others, but there'll be things very worthy of your time if you hang out with us. We'll be right with you. So, our girl Peyton is working on her project right now, and I think I could give you a little glimpse of that right now. So, there you go. You see her working on her digital artwork of the picture, my favorite picture of my dad sitting with my daughter. We'll come back to that at the end of the episode. But I had a clip I was going to show you from Cinderella Man. I think I want to start with that. And technology didn't work out, but that's okay. If you've seen the movie, you might not even remember this part of the movie because it might not affect you the way it did me. But it was toward the beginning of the movie, and Cinderella Man, of course, is about the true story of a boxer during the Great Depression named James Braddock. And he was struggling to find work, and so he took it to the ring to take care of his family. And at one point, early in the movie, his son was caught having stolen a sausage from a local butcher. And he came home and he wanted to set things straight, so he and his son went back to the butcher, and he made his son apologize and give the sausage back. And when they walked outside, his son kind of told him why he stole it. And he said, Marty Johnson, a friend of the son's from school, Marty Johnson had to go leave his family's home and live with an uncle in another state because they didn't have food to feed him. And it was at this point in the movie that when I first saw it, I broke down crying, just sobbing. Just because Marty Johnson in the movie could have been James Kirkwood. That's pretty much the first major event in my father's life, where in the Great Depression, he was born in 1930, and he was probably the only kid in his neighborhood who was the product of a divorced family. So he had two older siblings, a brother, Bob, and a sister named Jean, and James was the caboose of the family, and his much older father had divorced his mom, and mom couldn't afford to feed three kids. And so the two sons went to an orphanage. The older Bob and I think Duke was 6 at the time, and they went to an orphanage, which ironically in Connecticut was right across the street from a very wealthy family, the Hepburns. So my dad's first job was shoveling snow in Old Man Hepburn's driveway. But that's where he got his name Duke. His first day there, he found out that his older brother Bob had been nicknamed the Deacon. Everyone had a nickname in the orphanage. And some kid walked up to my dad and said, "Hey, I hear you're the Deacon's brother. How's it going, Jimmy Duke?" And that's where Duke got his nickname, which fit him well because as he grew older, he fell in love with boxing, and he was an amateur boxer. And I think he even fought under the name Jimmy Duke. So ever since then, he was the Duke. People want to know, was he named after John Wayne or something? No, Duke was named in the orphanage, and his brother Bob was the Deacon. But anyway, I bring this up to tell you the next probably main event of Duke's life, and that's when I think around 18 or 19, his mother gave him a Bible. Now, when Duke left the orphanage, he moved into an apartment. He worked full time, and he was still in high school. I think at the age of 16, he was in his own apartment, working full time, and putting himself through high school. And but somewhere around the age 18, I think his mom gave him a Bible, and he started like most people do at the beginning. And he got 22 chapters into the work when he got to what the Jews call the Akedah, the offering of Isaac by Abraham. And a young James Kirkwood, an atheist, self-professed atheist, took that book and was so furious he threw it across the room, and it bounced off a wall, landed on the floor, and it sat there for a bit. And boy, I wish my dad were still here, because I'd like to talk to him about what I see in that story now, and how he wasn't, as an atheist, he was probably closer to the truth about the true character of God than he would be as a professing Christian later in life. But that's a story for another day, and that's my story, not his. So I just want to walk you through his story. So he was an atheist, an aspiring boxer. He had a number of people from the Christian faith witness to him, including his dear sister Jean. And at some point, Jean took him to a Billy Graham crusade, and this is where my father left atheism behind for Christianity. And my father probably is what gave me my compulsiveness and obsession. And he kind of obsessed about things when he accepted them, and he did so with his new faith. So he went to Bible school, and he graduated as the valedictorian of Bible school. And the reason I want to share this with you is because both my parents planted something in their kids that was very important, and that was the ability to think critically and to be your own man. My mom used to always tell me, John, be your own man. Don't follow the crowd. If you come to the same conclusion as the crowd, fine, but don't unthinkingly just follow the crowd like a lemming. And my father actually lived that. So I bring this up to tell you, when he first became a Christian, he was led to the Lord, by his sister and the Billy Graham crusade. But the first place he landed in a church family was in a Pentecostal church. So he was in a Pentecostal movement for a while. But that critical thinking served him well, because he'd ask questions that either no one could answer, or the answers just weren't satisfying. They didn't seem to conform with reality, or quite frankly, the answers made him uncomfortable, because they seemed like they weren't really answers, they were excuses or something. And he grew increasingly uncomfortable with Pentecostalism, and that led him out of Pentecostalism. But he didn't forsake the faith. He moved from one room in the hall, as C.S. Lewis would say, came back out in the hall and tried another door. And that other door was a Baptist denomination. And he stewed in the Baptist denomination for a bit. And, this is after he met Mother Mary and they started a family. And I was born into that situation. We grew up in a Baptist movement. And he was even an associate pastor at a Baptist church in Buffalo Grove for a while, where, again, his critical thinking made him uncomfortable with the typical Baptist answers to certain questions he had. And those questions led him out of the Baptist denomination, because those questions made everybody around him uncomfortable. He was deconstructing not just Pentecostalism, but some of the conundrums of what Baptist theology teaches. And that led him into what people know as free grace, dispensationalism. Now, I know there are Baptists who are dispensationalists, and there are Baptists who believe in free grace theology, But that wasn't the kind of Baptist movement we were in. We were in very legalistic. Amen, Bella. We were in a very legalistic Baptist upbringing. And we struggled with that because it was, in essence, cruel and unkind in many ways. Filled with rules and regulations and quite off-putting. Not just to our neighbors, but to our own family. And it created quite a bit of turmoil in the family. And then my father took his first pastorate in Streamwood, and he was moving into the what's called the grace movement or free grace movement. And things got a lot better, both in the home and with his ministry, because he didn't focus on man-made rules. It was closer to the character of God and the nature of Jesus. And yet he always retained those critical thinking skills. He didn't just go along with the crowd in the free grace movement either. He had questions. Some of those questions he never answered. And I want to tell you this last story because it was the last time, and it's one of the reasons I truly respect my father. Now, as we're speaking right now, there's a memorial service being held for him at his old church in Illinois, and I wish those people well, but they're going to be hearing about Jim that they knew, which was their pastor. And I want to talk to you about Jim, the man, and my father. And so that's going to be a little bit different than what you'll hear over there. But this is what I love and respect about Jim as a man and as a father. Right before he started slipping into dementia, I was still a pastor in Illinois, and we'd have a meal together at least once a week, once every couple weeks, once a week if we could. And I remember at one of these family meals, I brought up that I had changed my view of the doctrine of hell. And he was curious and he was interested. And I shared with him why. I gave him the reasons why, gave him some resources to check out for himself. And here's a man who did subscribe to kind of a soft form of eternal conscious torment. Most of his ministry, this is what he kind of taught, although he wasn't a big hellfire and brimstone kind of a preacher. He wasn't that way at all. And he didn't believe, even when he believed in eternal conscious torment, he didn't think that torment was actual literal flames. He thought it was just isolation from God. But when we talked about it, I was amazed at how open he was. And when I finished talking to him about it, one person at the table was really uncomfortable with it because that person, hell was actually the reason that person got saved. In a Baptist church one day, some missionary came in and scared the hell, literally, into a youth group in which he was a part of. And so he ran to the cross, scared out of his mind, and embraced the gospel, the good news, because this missionary scared the hell out of him or into him or whatever. And so some people are more reluctant to even think that we might have gotten things wrong about hell. Not my father. And when he was still with it, his faculties were all still there. He was curious and he asked questions. And he said at the end of our conversation, "You know, son, I've suspected this, especially nearing the end of my ministry. I've always suspected this. I've always been uncomfortable with this other picture and doctrine of hell because it didn't seem like it truly represents the character of the God I know and love and the bodily fullness of God that we see in Jesus Christ." And I was amazed that an old dog could learn new tricks, because most people that you run into would dig their heels in. They'd say, "Oh yeah," they'd have a reason to dismiss it. They wouldn't be curious. They wouldn't be malleable enough to actually change that late in life, well into his 80s. He was still open to learning, and I might say, and it's not that I corrected him, but correction, that he was willing to be open to correct something that even he had taught while he was a pastor. It was those kind of moments that left a huge impression on me from both my mother and father, that they had that kind of humility that they brought to the table. Now, there's many people in the grace movement, in his church and my church, that didn't have that. Many people who are in the Christian faith adopt their reasoning and their worldview based on what that earlier example was, based on fear. And so they're actually afraid to consider a contrarian view. They're afraid to consider the question, what if I'm wrong? My father and my mother were never that way. And that's something that they brought to the family. That's the thing that I clearly remember, and I'm so grateful for today, because I had seen my father, or at least I had heard that he deconstructed first his atheism into Christianity, and then Pentecostalism into the Baptist theology, and then Baptist theology into free grace dispensationalism. But he wasn't even satisfied there, because he was on a lifelong pursuit of the truth. And he was looking for something that conformed more with reality and his understanding of both the Word of God as it is written and the Word of God as it is expressed in the person of Jesus Christ. And so at one point, I was in the 8th grade and I was taking notes in the pew, and he was teaching on Ephesians 5. And afterwards, it was a Thursday night, I went up to him and I asked him a question. This is an 8th grade kid, his youngest son. And I asked him a question about that passage. And he looked at the passage and he looked at me and he put his hand on my shoulder and he smiled. And he said, "Son, that's a great question. And to be honest with you, I don't know. I don't know. I don't have a good answer for you." And that was another moment that something clicked in me. Because how many theologians do you know, how many pastors you know actually have the humility to say, "I don't know"? That's one of the major problems of Christianity today. We have to be certain. We have to be rock solid on every question that might come to us. And it's really off-putting to a world that realizes that we have a complicated existence. And things aren't just that paint by number. There's something that makes me very suspicious about people who don't have any questions. Because to be honest with you, those are the same kind of people that don't experience wonder, the magic of wonder, or of finding something else new. They don't have a curiosity. It's fascinating. As a matter of fact, they see curiosity as a threat. To be dismissed or overcome, and not as an invitation to adventure. My father and my mother were not like that, and that's one of the things that I loved about growing up in the Kirkwood family. They actually nurtured the opposite. And by the way, they didn't mind if you disagreed with them. For many years, one of the children had very different political and religious views than the family held. And we had great conversations at the dinner table. They weren't arguments. They were great conversations. And I grew up in that environment and made me appreciate that. And it's one of those things that when I'd sit at other dinner tables from people at church, or I'd talk to other people and they'd say, "Oh, our house wasn't like that at all." No, you couldn't disagree at all at our dinner table. You'd be shamed and you'd be shunned. And this was like strange to me, because I grew up in an environment that relished intellectual honesty and freedom. And that made you feel like a real person, like you were loved unconditionally, and so forth. And my dad was a big part of that. Duke was a big part of that. So I bring up these events just to tell you that although I've arrived at some different conclusions about free grace and dispensationalism than where my father was before he started slipping into dementia. Even if he were here today and he still had his faculties, we'd have great conversations. And I probably wouldn't convince him of where I'm at necessarily on everything, but he'd be open and he'd ask great questions, not leading questions, not just trying to win an argument, not trying to debate. My father didn't believe in debate. He oftentimes would turn down debates with other theologians, saying, I'd rather have a conversation because there's winners and losers in a debate, and that's really not Christ-like. Let's have a conversation. Many great things my father taught me. One of them was, don't ask me about a person, ask me about an idea. People would come to him all the time and they'd say, oh, what do you think of this person? What do you think of this person? And my father would say that. He'd say, listen, don't ask me about a person. Ask me about an idea. He elevated the conversation to a higher level so it didn't become petty or less than or descended to gossip or slander or stuff like that. I'm going to check in with Peyton here and there. There she's painting around the quote. Anyway, so I'm so grateful I grew up in an environment like that. And I think that's the thing I'll miss the most about my father is that I'll miss our conversations. I'll miss his openness, his humility. Many things I'll miss about Duke. But I wanted to bring that up to you. Now I want to share the most important story about Duke, because being a pastor's kid isn't easy. And that's why I try to be tender with my own children. But I grew up in a pastor's house, and we went through a lot of turmoil. Not because of my father and mother, necessarily, at least not myself personally, but because of the church environment and the dangers of the relationship between a church and the pastor's family. And my parents really did their best to try and protect us from that and shield us from all of the collateral damage that often happens to pastors' children. But I'll tell you what, one thing that I saw with my mom and my dad is, most of what my dad taught in the pulpit, they lived out. My parents lived it out. They weren't selling something. They weren't selling a product they didn't use. The other day, Peyton and I were watching an old school Larry Sanders show where he was asked to do a live commercial on his show for the Garden Weasel. Remember that? And he didn't use the Garden Weasel, and he didn't want to do the commercial. And, it was kind of a farce. And you could tell when somebody's just taking a paycheck, collecting a paycheck. You could tell this with pastors, too. My dad, one of the great things he taught me as a pastor is if he was uncomfortable with a passage, he'd let you know. He'd say, I'm not really sure about this. I'm wrestling with it. I've been wrestling with it for 40 years. I haven't found a satisfactory answer. Or if there was something in a passage, he taught verse by verse. And if there was something in a passage that he didn't believe was taught in that passage, he wouldn't teach on it. He'd say, I'm wrestling with this. I'm going to skip over this verse, move forward. I'm not comfortable with teaching on it because I haven't really arrived on solid ground. So I'd move on. And so that taught me as a pastor, I'm not obligated to teach on things that I would either be a hypocrite for teaching or I'm teaching in the dark. And this is a great humility to teach somebody who's going into the pulpit. And I learned that from Dad. But this moment that I'm going to share with you, very personal moment, I've shared this, and then I'm going to wrap it up. But I've shared this moment with the people in the church because it's when I really grew in respect for my father. I've always known my parents love me. I've always known my parents believe what they believe and they live what they believe. They believe what they read in the Bible and what they've taken from it. And they try and live by those precepts that they believe and that they put forward in their own ministry. And my favorite story in all of the Bible, and this makes Luke my favorite author in the Bible, but is the story of what we know as the. Oh, Caspian wants to go in your room. Doesn't he know you're here? Caspian, she's here. The meowing you hear is Prince Caspian trying to get in Peyton's room. But where were we? I think the greatest story ever told is Jesus telling the story of what we call the prodigal son. What I call the wayward sons in Luke 15, and that story was my favorite before I actually found myself living it, found myself in the story. But my father was a big fan of Warren Wiersbe, and Warren Wiersbe had this book called Meet Yourself in the Parables, right? And I've met myself in the Bible many times, and sometimes, and I say this to you with great humility and frankly with great humiliation, is sometimes you find yourself in the Bible and it's not a good passage. You know, it's not like one of those tests you take in social media that says, find out who you are in the Bible. And you answer a few questions and then you're King David or you're Mary, mother of Jesus. Where all the answers are good, all the answers are good. And, sometimes you find yourself in the Bible and you're Peter, on his worst day when he denies Christ. I mean, sometimes you're in the lunchroom at work and somebody brings something up and you hold your tongue and you're like Peter warming himself at the fire, humbled by a young maid who's accusing you of something. Sometimes you're Judas. Sometimes, yeah, you feel that bad. Sometimes you're just a very cruel person, and you catch yourself, and it reminds you that you're King Saul, or even Cain, or something like that. Maybe betrayal of a brother you hurt. That's a sad thing about life. Is oftentimes the people we hurt the most are the ones who are closest to us, the dearest to us. But I actually lived the prodigal son, and so I tell you the story. To give you a taste of who my father was. When I was young, I got into a lot of trouble. I went into a far country, and there was a few dark chapters in the book I was writing. I made some poor choices. I was bitter. I was angry. I was careless. I was reckless. And so I got into a lot of trouble. So I actually had a personal relationship with a lawyer pretty young in life because I needed his services on a number of occasions. And so I had my lawyer's number in my favorite 5 back then on my phone. And at one point I was kind of playing, or at least rehearsing in a band with a very big, well-known drug dealer in the Chicago area, and he was a good guitarist too, and he had great money for equipment. So and he was a friend. He was actually a friend of mine. He wasn't just somebody I was in. And one day we were on our way to play, and he had his guitar and I had my bass guitar, and as per usual, he dealt drugs every day, and that day was no exception, although he was dealing with a new customer and it was a rather large amount. So he was taking care of business and I was waiting in the truck, and he got out and we drove away, and little did I know that there was a Metropolitan Enforcement Group combination investigation into my friend with the Drug Enforcement Agency and the Des Plaines Police, and they all decided that they didn't want us to drive away, and so cars circled us, and we were taken into custody, and I was taken into the Des Plaines Police Department. It wasn't the first time, but I was taken into the Des Plaines Police Department and put in a holding cell, and I called my lawyer with my one phone call. So I'm sitting there having a bad day, waiting for my lawyer to get there, and in walks my father. Now, my lawyer hadn't called my father, and I was expecting to see my lawyer, and when I saw my father, I was literally dumbstruck, just like the prodigal when he returned home, how he couldn't speak. I couldn't speak. I stood up from my cot and I looked in his eyes and I saw sorrow. I saw disappointment. I saw a man with a broken heart, and I was waiting to hear either "I told you so" or "How could you do this to your mother?" or "You ruined our family." I was waiting to hear all kinds of things, just like the prodigal was waiting to barter with his father because he didn't think enough of him. And my father didn't say a word. He walked over to me, he put his arms around me, and he kissed my neck and said, "I love you, son." Oh, wow. Well, it turns out, and I'll tell you this about my father as a pastor. I'll tell you a little bit about my father as a pastor because it's important, and it's pretty much what they're going to be hearing at the church. But I'd rather focus on him as a man because you can't take my father as a man out of his decisions in the pulpit. The reason my father was there and not my lawyer is because one of the people who used to go to our church was a Des Plaines Police Department officer, detective. And he'd seen me perp walked into his station, and he called my father. The thing was, after that day, he never came back to the church. That family left the church because the father's son was a criminal. And, you know, I'd be lying to you if I said this wasn't the first family that I had caused to leave my father's church because of bad decision making. But that was the price you pay, right? And so my father came in and he fell on my neck and he kissed me. And at that moment, I was the prodigal son. But also at that moment, my father had acted like the father in the prodigal story. And so he was God to me, because that's who it is in the story. That's how God loves each and every one of us. That's what God would have done if he walked into that jail cell that day. God fell on my neck and kissed me and said, "I love you, my son." And that moment changed my life. It changed the trajectory of my life. It changed my decision making. It enhanced an already large view that I had had of my father. I tasted grace. I tasted unconditional love. I saw God in a more clearer light. So I appreciate that moment, not just because I left that moment thinking more of my father, but I left that moment thinking more of Christ. And I will tell you this, that one kiss, that one gesture, that one moment meant more to me, taught me more than 1,000 sermons that I had sat under in his church. Not because he hadn't expounded the word articulately and eloquently many times before, but because I had been sucked in, you know, like a Narnian moment. I had been sucked into Narnia, and I met Aslan in that moment. And it's different than reading about it when you become part of the story. Changed my life. And it could have changed my life depending on how he would have handled it, like lesser men would have handled that moment in a different way. It could have hardened me instead of softened me. So I share that moment with you to give you a taste of what the Duke was like. One more moment about him in church and sticking up to bullies. There are a lot of, forgive me, there are a lot of miscreants, ne'er-do-wells. There are a lot of creeps in church. And this is why a lot of people are leaving church. Because a lot of times, narcissists, or we call them type A personalities, psychologists call them narcissists. A lot of times those people that are very forceful personalities end up in positions of leadership in the church. This was no different in my father's churches or in my father's boards. And so he had to confront bullies on occasion. And I share this story with you because I think it's rather profound. And I'm going to end with this, and we're going to come to Peyton in a few minutes. But there was a fellow who came to my father's church and he had a bad reputation because he had split his previous church and caused division in a church previous to that. And he came to my church and he asked to sit under my father's ministry, and my father actually welcomed him with open arms, although he did hear warnings that this guy's bad news. You know, he's a bad apple. But my father was that way. He was always willing to give somebody an opportunity and a chance. He believed that people could be redeemed because he had seen it over and over again. And then, of course, redemption isn't the rule; it's the exception, oftentimes. And it was the exception in this person's case, because this person went on to split my father's church. He was as bad as the previous pastors has said, and he probably still is to this day. But he ended up splitting the church and causing great heartache in our church and in our family. But at this point, he was still sitting in the pew, and he hadn't caused the split yet. And this man, his daughter, got pregnant out of wedlock. And so I remember this moment as part of the pastor's family. This man came to my father, and he wanted justification for a decision he had made. He wanted my father to stamp, to sanctify a decision he had made. And the decision he had made is to throw his daughter out of the house because his daughter had shamed the family name. So he was going to throw her out. In the name of Jesus, throw her out. And my father said to him, and I remember this, "Why would you do that to her when she needs you now more than ever? Why would that be your decision when she needs unconditional love from you and your wife and her siblings now more than ever?" In an impressive fashion, my father talked this man out of doing that, out of throwing her out of the house. Nobody knows that story. My father never told it publicly. He never used it against the man when the man said, communicated lies and untruths about him to split the church. He never, that was pastor confidentiality with this fellow. I don't have that with this guy. This guy's a grade A jackass. So I can share that story with you. I still won't mention his name, but some of the people who've gone to our church will know exactly who it is, and I'm willing to live with that. But my dad never used that against him. My dad never used, he was not a vindictive person in that way. And that's something I admire about my father. That's something I wish I could do better with. That's something I still grapple with. So anyway, a lot of great things to say about my father, but the greatest thing I could say about my father is he tried to live out the worldview that he had accepted and believed in. He was not a hypocrite in that way. He did his best to try and live by those things that he accepted as true, as good, and as beautiful. And he instilled in our family life the importance of critical thinking, of following truth where it leads you, no matter what, no matter who it costs you or what it costs you, that there's, if God is truth, right, then that pursuit of truth actually can lead us out of error. And that is a good thing. And that is something that does come with a cost. But it's more important than living comfortably numb or having your head in the sand in some kind of blissful state of ignorance. So thank you, Dad, for all you've meant to me and to my family. Thank you for giving me life and being probably the most important figure and mentor in teaching me what it means to be a man. Thank you for planting those seeds within me that keep me humble, that keep me open to truth, that make me ask the question, what if I'm wrong? Thank you for the life that you gave to Nate and Steve and Bethel and myself and Mary and my family. And rest easy, Duke.
What?
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Because I'm ready. You ready to show what you've got? Okay.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are actually going to Chicago this weekend, and we're going to be able to stand by the graveside of my mother and father, share some moments with my brother and sister. So I appreciate all of you who have sent your condolences and shared your stories or your shared sorrow with the Kirkwood family in this our time. So thank you too for your thoughtfulness. So let's see what you got, Poe. Wow. Can you make that like full screen? Oh, that looks awesome. I want you to print that out for me. I'm going to frame that one. That one's going to hang in here somewhere, maybe right over here.
Okay.
Do you have anything you want to say about Grandpa Duke before we tune off?
I'm not sure.
Okay, that's okay. You've done more than enough with your artwork. Thanks. Thanks for listening, folks. God bless you.